He can't see, but somehow he still thinks he belongs here. The words cut through first class like a slap, loud, deliberate, and aimed straight at the man sitting in seat 1A. He was black. He was blind. And he had just become the target of the kind of cruelty that hides behind confidence and privilege. The passenger beside him laughed, gestured to a flight attendant, and demanded, "Is this some kind of charity upgrade? I paid to sit with professionals, not pity projects." No one intervened. No one objected. Not yet. But what none of them knew, what that man had no way of knowing, was that the quiet black man they were mocking was the only person on that flight with the power to decide who stays in the sky and who never flies again. This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's about how power doesn't always speak loud. It waits. And when it reveals itself, it changes everything. If this moment hit you, hit like, subscribe for more stories that expose the truth behind appearances, and drop a comment. What would you have done if you witnessed this? And where are you watching from? Let's talk. The air at Gate 16A carried the usual noise of pre-boarding. Strollers squeaked, keyboards clicked, and overhead announcements buzzed over half-heard conversations. Thomas Greer stood patiently by the side rail, his hand wrapped around the top of his white cane, the polished wooden grip worn down from years of use. The black sunglasses covering his eyes couldn't hide the calm dignity in his posture or the stillness in his presence. He wasn't flashy. His navy blazer was neatly pressed, his slacks clean, his shoes shined to a humble glow. Yet even before taking a single step onto the jet bridge, he felt it. The hesitation, the silent judgment, the shift in the air as others noticed him. Bradley Carter, 3 people behind Thomas in the priority boarding line, noticed too. His voice wasn't raised, but it was sharp enough to cut. "Guess they're letting anyone in priority now," he muttered to a fellow passenger with a smirk, not bothering to lower his tone. Didn't know social programs extended to first class. The woman next to him gave a tight smile, unsure whether to laugh or move away. Thomas heard it. He didn't flinch. He never did. He simply stepped forward when the gate agent called for passengers needing assistance, and those with priority boarding to proceed. "First class 1A," the attendant said warmly, guiding him toward the jet bridge. Bradley snorted. "1A? For real? That's the seat with the most legroom. Bet he won't even notice it." Another chuckle followed. Someone behind them whispered something about diversity gone too far. Thomas didn't turn around, didn't respond. He was used to this. But each time, the silence cut deeper than any words. He walked on, not because it didn't affect him, but because he'd spent a lifetime learning how to bury what did. Inside the aircraft, the front row gleamed with soft lighting and polished wood accents. A young flight attendant greeted Thomas, offering her arm. "Right here, Mr. Greer. Let me guide you in." He thanked her quietly, settling into 1A with practiced ease, folding his cane and placing it gently beneath the seat in front of him. He adjusted his wristwatch by touch and leaned back into the plush leather, trying to steady his breath. But it wasn't peace he found. It was anticipation, tension. He'd felt it brewing the moment he stepped into the terminal. Behind him, Bradley finally boarded. His cologne entered the cabin before he did, loud and invasive. He froze when he saw who was seated next to him. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "This is who I'm sitting next to?" The flight attendant turned quickly. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but strained. Bradley gestured toward Thomas, as if he were a broken seat or a spilled drink. "I paid $1,000 for comfort, not to be babysat." Thomas turned slightly, his voice calm but pointed. "I assure you, sir, I'm not in need of a sitter." Bradley scoffed and dropped into his seat, muttering, "We'll see about that." He exaggerated his movements, spreading his arms, bumping into Thomas's space, then loudly snapping his fingers for service. When the attendant returned, Bradley didn't lower his voice. "Do you have a cloth or something to put between us?" he asked. "I don't want to catch something." Thomas didn't speak. He folded his hands in his lap, breathing in through his nose. He had been insulted before. He had endured whispers, dismissals, even outright refusal. But this felt worse. Because here, in a place meant to symbolize status, recognition, reward, he was being stripped of dignity in front of strangers. "You can't even enjoy the view," Bradley said suddenly. "What's the point of sitting in 1A if you can't see the sky?" That one hit, not because it was clever, but because it was true. Thomas tilted his head slightly toward the window. "I can still feel the sun," he said, his voice softer now. But inside, something had shifted. The comment lingered, deepening a crack that had formed the moment he walked onto that plane. Bradley wasn't finished. "I bet you got this seat free," he said. "Probably some community outreach program. Disability privilege. You people always find a way." Thomas's hands gripped the arms of his chair tighter. He didn't speak this time, not because he didn't have words, but because he was trying not to lose them. For decades, he taught himself to rise above it. But the higher he rose, the more people like Bradley pulled at his ankles. He felt something unfamiliar now, not anger. Something heavier. The weight of accumulated moments, of every smirk, every slight, every time someone pretended he didn't belong. "Don't you have headphones or something?" Bradley said, waving at the attendant. "I don't want to have to talk around him the whole flight." Still no response from Thomas. But his lips had parted, slightly, and his chin dipped just enough that the attendant, who glanced at him briefly, saw it. The first sign of fracture. Behind his sunglasses, his eyelids had tightened. Not out of rage, but restraint. Something in him, something long protected, was beginning to strain under pressure. The plane wasn't even in the air yet, but Thomas already felt the descent. The engines hadn't even started yet, but the pressure in Thomas Greer's chest felt heavier than cabin altitude. He sat silently in seat 1A, shoulders still, eyes hidden behind his sunglasses, jaw set in a line that tried to hold together what little dignity Bradley hadn't already chipped away. The air between them was thick with contempt, unspoken on one side, ceaselessly spoken on the other. Bradley leaned over with a grin that wasn't friendly, his voice low enough to pretend privacy, loud enough to ensure humiliation. "Tell me something," he said, elbow grazing Thomas's arm intentionally. "Do they give you a discount for being blind, or is that just part of the sympathy package?" Thomas didn't respond. He wouldn't. His hands were steady in his lap, but his fingertips pressed together more tightly than before. Bradley took his silence as permission and pressed further. "Must be nice," he continued, "not to have to look people in the eye when you freeload your way into first class." That one slice deeper. Thomas had spent his life earning everything. He had worked harder than most just to be treated as average. And now, with nothing but silence to defend him, he was being told that none of it mattered. Not to men like Bradley. To them, he would always be some poor blind man lucky to have a seat near them. "I mean," Bradley went on, waving toward the aisle with a smirk, "there's a whole section back there for people like you. Middle seat. Low expectations. It's built for comfort. You don't have to see how bad it looks." He laughed quietly, as if he were the cleverest man alive. Thomas slowly turned his face toward the sound, not to respond, but to breathe. The breath came tight and shallow, the kind that tried to carry more than lungs were meant to hold. The truth was, Thomas didn't want to be here anymore. Not in this seat, not in this cabin, not in this moment. And he hated himself for thinking that. He hated how Bradley was winning. He hated the quiet ache in his stomach that told him to move, to ask for a different seat, to escape instead of endure. But he stayed, not because he felt strong, but because if he gave in, then Bradley would be right. A flight attendant approached to offer drinks, her smile flickering when she sensed the tension. "Can I get you gentlemen anything to start?" she asked. "Yes," Bradley said quickly. "Two things, a whiskey for me, and maybe something to help this guy find the exit." The attendant's smile faltered. Thomas didn't move. "Sir," she said gently, "would you like anything?" Thomas's lips parted slightly. "Water," he said quietly. "Room temperature." It was the only thing he could think to say. It was the only part of him not breaking. Bradley leaned back with a sigh. "Water," he repeated mockingly. "Figures. What else is free?" The attendant gave him a pointed glance, but said nothing. As she walked away, Bradley muttered, "Bet you wouldn't be so quiet if you weren't afraid someone might ask what you do for a living." Thomas turned his head toward him, slowly this time, and said, "I didn't know basic decency was a paid profession." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Bradley blinked, caught off guard for just a moment, then laughed. "Okay, you've got jokes. I'll give you that. But here's the thing. This is first class. There's an unspoken code here. You dress the part. You act the part. You don't get here by accident. And you sure as hell don't belong here by default." Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt tight now. He shifted slightly, trying to ease the weight inside his chest. It wasn't just rage. It was grief. Old, quiet grief. The kind you don't cry about anymore, because the tears dried out years ago. It was the ache of knowing that no matter how polished your shoes are, someone will still see mud on your feet. "You know," Bradley added, adjusting his cufflinks, "they let people like you sit up here to make a statement. Token representation. Look at us, so inclusive, so modern. It's not personal. It's just optics." Thomas clenched his hands in his lap, his right thumb pressed against his left palm, tracing the faint scar he'd carried since childhood, an accident on his grandfather's farm. He remembered the pain vividly. He remembered fighting through it. And now he remembered why. Because every injury he ever endured had trained him to survive moments like this. But surviving was starting to feel like surrender. The flight attendant returned with the drinks. She handed Thomas his water carefully, pausing just a second longer than necessary. There was empathy in her silence, but not enough courage. "Not yet." "Thanks," Thomas murmured. He took a small sip, more to fill the silence than to quench thirst. Across the aisle, a businessman watched the exchange, his brow furrowed, his body turned slightly toward them. He wasn't ready to speak up, but he was no longer pretending not to notice. Thomas felt that shift. Bradley shifted in his seat with exaggerated movements, nudging Thomas's elbow with deliberate force. "Careful," he said, smirking. "Didn't want you to spill your water. Or maybe you didn't even know it was in your hand." Thomas remained silent, shifting just enough to put distance between them. He wasn't surprised by the contact, but it tightened the knot already forming in his chest. It wasn't just the touch, it was the intent behind it. Bradley wasn't drunk. He was testing boundaries. And each time Thomas didn't respond, the man grew bolder. Bradley crossed his legs and bumped Thomas's cane, which had been neatly tucked beneath the seat. It rolled slightly to the side, barely audible, but Thomas immediately noticed. His hand reached instinctively to check, but it wasn't where it was supposed to be. "Looking for something?" Bradley asked, feigning innocence. "I think it slipped under. Could be dangerous. Someone might trip on it. Someone important." Thomas kept his voice calm. "Could you hand it back, please?" Bradley leaned down slowly, grabbed the cane, and held it out, not toward Thomas's hands, but toward his chest, hovering inches from his collar. "Here you go, sir," he said mockingly. "Should I bow, or is that only for the real VIPs?" Thomas took the cane gently, avoiding contact. "Thank you," he said, though his tone carried no warmth. He hated the way Bradley's voice dripped with irony, how even the simplest gesture was turned into a show of dominance. But worse than the words were the passengers who watched, eyes flickering, heads turning back toward their books or screens, pretending not to witness what was plainly unfolding before them. A man gets humiliated in silence, and the world calls it dignity. Bradley leaned back and sighed, folding his arms smugly. "You're a real quiet type, huh? Stoic, or just used to being ignored?" Thomas turned his head toward the window, not because he could see, but because it gave him something to face that wasn't filled with contempt. He imagined the sky, beyond the glass, blue, endless, pure. A sky no one could pollute with small minds and sharp tongues. "Must be tough," Bradley continued, undeterred. "Never really knowing who's laughing at you. I mean, they could be smiling to your face and stabbing your back, and you'd never know. But maybe that's the secret to your confidence, ignorance." Thomas's jaw flexed, just once. His hands tightened around his cane. It wasn't just the insult, it was the truth in it. Not the part Bradley intended, but the deeper reality. Thomas did live in the dark. And sometimes, that darkness crept inward. Not just physical, but emotional. Isolated, untouchable. The sense of never fully belonging, even when you earned your place. Especially when you earned your place. The flight attendant returned to collect empty glasses, her eyes darting between the two men. "Everything all right here?" she asked, though the strain in her voice revealed that she already knew the answer. "Couldn't be better," Bradley said, flashing a bright grin. "Just having a chat with my seatmate. Fascinating guy." Thomas gave a slight nod. "All fine," he murmured. The attendant hesitated, then moved on. She wasn't going to intervene. Not yet. Not until something broke. And Thomas could feel it. Something was close to breaking. Bradley pulled out his phone, tapped it a few times, then held it up and angled it vaguely in Thomas's direction. "Smile," he said. "Might go viral." First-class philosopher with a stick and a stare. Thomas turned away again, choosing silence as a shield. But the shield was thinning. Inside, he wasn't just frustrated. He was unraveling. His thoughts became harder to contain, his chest tighter with every breath. Bradley's final blow came without warning. He reached down and brushed the edge of Thomas's duffel bag with his foot, nudging it slightly into the aisle. "Oops," he said, loud enough to draw eyes. "Trip hazard. We better clear that out. Can't have the help leaving messes behind." Thomas didn't speak. He bent slowly, carefully, reached for his bag, and brought it back to its place. His movement was methodical, but his hands trembled just slightly. Enough for Bradley to notice. Enough for Thomas to feel it too. When he sat back up, his breathing had changed, no longer steady, now shallow and measured, like someone trying to outrun a panic that hadn't fully arrived. He hadn't said a word of protest. But inside, the foundation he'd built over decades, discipline, resilience, composure, was cracking. The plane hadn't even reached cruising altitude, yet the air around them burned hotter than jet fuel. And Bradley, drunk on attention, pushed harder. "You know what the problem is?" he said, leaning sideways into the aisle so others could hear. "They're lowering the bar for who gets into first class. It used to mean something. Now it's just anyone with a sob story and a GoFundMe." A few passengers looked up from their screens, their eyes scanning the cabin, registering the tension, but doing nothing to defuse it. Thomas didn't flinch, but his breathing grew slower, heavier. His fingers grazed the edge of his cane like a tether to something grounded. Bradley went on, raising his voice just enough to infect the row ahead. "No offense," he said, gesturing casually at Thomas, "but when I pay for this seat, I expect to share the space with executives, not exceptions." There it was. Not just a critique of Thomas's presence, but a denial of his entire identity. An exception. Not a peer. Not a fellow human. An outlier. A fluke. And in that word, Bradley found all the permission he needed. "I mean, we don't even know if he actually paid for it," Bradley added. "Could have been a sympathy upgrade. Maybe the airline has a blind guy quota to meet. Wouldn't surprise me." That comment stirred something in the row behind. A young woman, blonde and professionally dressed, shifted uncomfortably, her brow furrowing. But she didn't speak. No one did. Thomas sat frozen in the heat of their cowardice. "Honestly," Bradley said, voice louder now, almost performative, "if you can't enjoy the view, or read the menu, or even watch a film, why not sit and coach? Leave these seats for people who can actually use them." The laughter he expected didn't come. The silence in the cabin turned thick, shameful, and for the first time, Bradley's voice faltered. But it was brief. He filled the pause with another smirk and nudged Thomas again, not with his elbow, but with his words. "Or maybe you like it up here, because no one can see you for what you really are." That one landed deep. Thomas's head tilted slightly downward, the way it always did when he felt himself slipping. When his chest tightened not just with humiliation, but with anger. Real, raw, dangerous anger. The kind he had trained himself for decades to suppress. Because the world did not allow black men, especially blind ones, the luxury of visible rage. He swallowed it. Again. Because that's what survival had always demanded. But this time, the bitterness was heavier going down. The flight attendant approached with the meal cart, pausing at their row, her smile practiced but strained. "Would you gentlemen care for lunch?" she asked, her voice thin with unease. "Oh, we're calling this lunch," Bradley scoffed, not missing a beat. "You sure he can eat it without a Braille menu? Maybe puree it for him, just to be safe." The attendant hesitated, her smile now gone completely. "Sir," she said softly, "I'd appreciate it if you lowered your voice." "Why?" he snapped. "Because he might hear me? Trust me, I'm doing him a favor. At least I'm talking to him." Thomas didn't move. He didn't touch the food tray placed before him. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't speak. But inside, he was shouting. Not at Bradley. Not even at the crew. But at himself, for staying seated. For letting this happen. For every breath he took instead of rising. For every moment of silence that the world called grace, when really it was just a mask for pain. "You know," Bradley said, voice now dripping with mock sincerity, "you're real quiet for someone who's sitting where you don't belong. Say something. Or do blind folks not talk either?" That question broke something. Not enough to show, but enough for Thomas to feel the fracture. Like the last hairline crack in glass before the whole pane caves in. He turned his head, not in anger, but with a terrifying calm, and faced the direction of the voice. "If I said what I wanted to," he said, voice low and slow, "they'd call it aggression. But if I stay silent, you call it weakness." Bradley blinked, caught off guard. "So maybe," Thomas continued, his voice steady, "you don't want me to speak. You want me to react. You want me to break, so you can feel stronger standing over the pieces." The flight attendant froze mid-step. The woman behind them stopped typing. Even Bradley paused, just for a breath. But it passed. "Relax," he said with a sneer. "I'm just making conversation. You should be grateful someone even acknowledges you." The laughter had stopped, but the looks hadn't. The whispering had started again. Only now, it wasn't coming from Bradley. It came from the other rows, the other eyes, the people who had chosen not to speak, but not to look away either. People who watched injustice unfold and responded by adjusting their seatbelt and pretending turbulence was to blame for their discomfort. Bradley noticed. And worse, he relished it. "Funny, isn't it?" he said, twisting in his seat to look over his shoulder. "You can feel it. The energy. Everyone's thinking it, but I'm the only one who says it." A woman in the aisle seat across from them quickly turned her face to the window, pretending to check the sky. A man in the row ahead shifted uncomfortably and raised his headphones, but didn't press play. They were hearing every word. Bradley continued, encouraged by their silence. "I mean, look around. You think anyone here really believes he belongs in first class? They're just too polite to say it." He leaned toward the aisle, catching the attention of the flight attendant as she passed. "Excuse me," he called, his tone suddenly sugary sweet. "Would it be possible to switch seats? I'm not feeling quite comfortable here." The attendant, already tense from earlier, stopped. "I'm afraid the flight is full, sir," she replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Right," Bradley said with exaggerated disappointment. "I figured. Guess I'll just have to endure." He looked over at Thomas and smiled, the kind of smile that dripped sarcasm like venom. "We do what we must." Thomas didn't look at him. He didn't need to. Every word landed with the same weight. Every gesture stung the same. But what gnawed him more than Bradley's cruelty was how effortlessly the cabin had accepted it. He could feel the shift in presence, like people had physically leaned away from him without moving. The energy had changed. He wasn't just being mocked. He was being isolated, reduced, diminished. An unwanted guest in a space where status was measured by silence, suits, and skin. The flight attendant passed again with a tray of warm towels, offering one to Bradley first. Bradley accepted it with a grin, wiping his hands slowly like a surgeon preparing for another incision. When she turned to Thomas, she hesitated, barely for a second, but enough for him to notice. Enough for him to feel it. "Towel, sir?" she asked, her tone cooler now. "No, thank you," Thomas said. His voice didn't tremble, but it was hollow, stripped of warmth. He wasn't refusing out of politeness. He was refusing because he was starting to believe he didn't deserve even that. Bradley leaned closer again, his voice now mock conspiratorial. You ever notice how people stop seeing you when they think you don't belong? It's like magic. One moment you're a human being, the next you're a piece of scenery. Thomas didn't respond. Not because he didn't have words, but because every time he tried to form them, he heard his own father's voice. Don't let them see you break. But he was close. So close. Bradley sat back and sighed contentedly. First class, he said, raising his glass, where exclusion is the most expensive luxury on earth. The man in the row ahead turned slightly, as if about to say something, then stopped. He looked at Thomas, just a glance, and quickly looked away, pretending to adjust his air vent. That glance said everything. It said, I see what's happening. And it also said I won't be part of it. That was worse than hate. Indifference had teeth. The flight attendant returned with meals, and as she lowered the tray onto Thomas's table, her hand brushed his fingers. She flinched and pulled back slightly, then caught herself and smiled. But it was too late. Thomas felt it, felt how even compassion now came with caution. He stared down at the untouched meal, the tray pristine, the food arranged like art. He had no appetite. Bradley began eating with gusto, letting out exaggerated sounds of approval. Delightful. You should try it, he said to Thomas. I'm sure they'll even cut it for you if you ask nicely. Bradley, full of smug satisfaction, had grown quieter for a time, busying himself with his second drink and the occasional laugh under his breath, as if entertaining himself with some private joke. But even when he wasn't speaking, he still filled the air. His energy pressed against Thomas's shoulders like weight, like heat, like static waiting to strike. The tension hadn't left. It had just changed form. Then came the moment that would tip everything. A young mother walked by from the economy cabin, gently rocking a crying toddler in her arms. She paused near the curtain, clearly trying not to disturb anyone, hoping to soothe her child in the slightly quieter space. Bradley looked up and shook his head in mock dismay. Of course, he said loudly enough for the nearby rows to hear. First the blind man, now the babies. This flight is turning into a community center. A few heads turned. The mother stiffened but said nothing, clutching her child tighter as she hurried back toward her seat. Bradley turned to Thomas, chuckling. You hear that? Or do your ears not work either? Thomas didn't respond. Not with words. But something in him finally cracked. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sorrow. It was something deeper, darker. It was the realization that for all his years of perseverance, all the quiet strength and dignity he had tried to live by, the world still saw him the same way it did the day he lost his sight. Weak, broken, less than. And in this moment, with a man beside him who delighted in cruelty and a cabin full of passengers too polite to interfere, Thomas felt the full weight of that truth crash down. He lowered his head slowly, not in defeat, but in a gesture of protection, as if trying to shield something inside from the final blow. Bradley smirked, sensing movement. What's the matter? He asked. Headache? Can't take the altitude? Or just tired of pretending you belong up here? Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no rebuttal left, no clever response, no calm wisdom. His throat felt dry, and his chest ached, not from fear, but from restraint. He had held everything in for so long that now, when he most needed to speak, there was nothing left to push through the silence. The flight attendant passed again, and this time she stopped, her eyes briefly locking on Thomas's bowed head. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't kneel beside him. She only offered the same question she gave every passenger. Would you like dessert? Thomas lifted his face slowly. No, he said softly. I'd like this flight to be over. She didn't reply. She moved on. And in that, he understood something terrifying. Even when you scream without sound, most people won't hear you. Bradley leaned back with a satisfied grunt. Hey, he said to no one in particular. Someone remind me to never fly this airline again. It used to mean something. Now it's a charity. A voice spoke from the row behind them. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. That's enough. Everyone heard it. Bradley paused. Excuse me, he said, turning around. The speaker was an older man in a gray blazer, his expression unreadable. You've said enough, the man repeated. Bradley scoffed. Oh, we're doing this now? The hero moment? Save the helpless. The man didn't flinch. I'm not saving anyone. I'm just tired of listening to you embarrass yourself. A ripple of silence followed. No one applauded. No one spoke. But for the first time since the plane left the ground, Bradley had no retort. He turned back in his seat, jaw tight, and muttered something under his breath that no one cared to hear. Thomas turned his head slightly in the direction of the voice. He didn't know the man's name. He didn't need to. All he needed to know was that someone had finally said something. But even then, it didn't erase the weight. Before grace became armor. It wasn't the insult that reawakened him. It wasn't Bradley's last jab or the cabin's quiet betrayal. It was the sudden, simple realization that he didn't have to play this game anymore. He never did. Because this cabin, this airline, this entire sky, none of it existed without him. A low chime echoed through the intercom as the flight attendants began preparing for descent. Bradley stretched in his seat, his third drink nearly empty, still smirking like a man who thought he had won a private war. Finally, he muttered, "Now we can land and go our separate ways. Don't worry," he added without turning his head. "I won't tell anyone about your little adventure up here. Your secret's safe with me." Thomas didn't react immediately. He inhaled through his nose and exhaled slowly, calmly. Then, with a kind of deliberateness that drew attention without volume, he reached up and removed his sunglasses. A few passengers noticed. It was subtle but symbolic, like a soldier laying down his helmet, not in surrender, but in challenge. His eyes, though clouded with blindness, held clarity in their stillness. He turned toward the aisle, lifted his chin, and in a voice that carried more weight than volume, he said, "Is the lead attendant nearby?" The younger attendant from earlier, Emily, approached, hesitant but respectful. "Yes, sir. Is there anything you need?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Tell the captain," he said, "to prepare to receive Executive 1. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was paralyzing. Bradley stopped mid-sip. The nearby passengers paused. Even Emily's face lost all color. I'm sorry," she said, blinking. "Executive 1, repeat?" Thomas tilted his head slightly. "I assume your training covered that term. Or perhaps I should speak directly with Captain Harris. Tell him Thomas Greer is aboard." She froze. "Sir, Mr. Greer, you can use the interphone if you prefer," he added gently. "Or knock on the cockpit door. Either way, protocol demands the crew is informed immediately." Her hands moved instinctively to the service phone, but her eyes stayed fixed on his face, as if trying to reconcile everything they had seen this entire flight with what she now knew. Bradley, still processing the words, let out a half laugh. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" Thomas turned toward him, and although his eyes didn't lock onto Bradley's directly, the force of his presence landed like a blow. "You've been talking for hours," Thomas said, voice calm but powerful, "and you still haven't said a single true thing." "Executive 1? What the hell does that mean?" Bradley asked, his tone rattled now, unsure for the first time. Emily answered him before Thomas could. "It's the call sign we use when one of the principal owners of the airline is aboard," she said softly, still stunned. "It overrides normal passenger priority. And protocol requires." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The news traveled down the aisles like static, sharp and electric. From first class to business, whispers spread fast, passengers turning heads, leaning into each other, eyes wide. Thomas remained still, his cane now resting loosely in his hand again. He wasn't angry. He wasn't smug. He was simply done pretending to be less than he was. A heavy knock came from the cockpit door, and the senior flight officer, uniform crisp, expression unreadable, stepped into the cabin. He walked directly to Thomas and offered a quiet, formal nod. "Mr. Greer," he said, "we apologize for the oversight. The captain extends his greetings. Is there anything we can do to make your descent more comfortable?" Bradley's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The man who had spent the entire flight manufacturing dominance now sat frozen, exposed. Thomas considered the question, then shook his head. "No," he replied. "Let's just land the plane." The officer nodded once more, then turned sharply and disappeared into the cockpit. A new kind of silence filled the cabin, thick, reverent, irreversible. Across the aisle, Bradley Carter sat unnaturally still. His hands, once gesturing wildly with bravado, were now flat against his knees. His jaw clenched tight, the color drained from his face. For the first time, he understood silence not as dominance, but as consequence. It was the kind of silence that demanded reflection, and, in his case, regret. The lead flight attendant, senior, composed, and with a clipboard in hand, emerged from the galley and approached Thomas's row. She didn't wear the thin smile the crew had trained themselves to deliver. This wasn't customer service anymore. This was protocol. She stopped beside Thomas, offered a formal nod, and spoke in a voice loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "Mr. Greer," she said, "on behalf of the entire crew, we sincerely apologize for any failure to recognize your presence and status on board. I've reviewed the incident and—" Thomas raised a hand gently, cutting her off. "This isn't about recognition," he said, his tone calm but firm. "It's about behavior." She paused, nodded again, and cleared her throat. "Understood, sir. The report will reflect that." Then, without being prompted, she turned toward Bradley. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice sharper now, "due to multiple violations of our passenger conduct policy, including harassment, disruption of cabin order, and personal attacks against a member of our executive board, you will be formally reported to corporate security." Bradley flinched. "Wait, hold on. You'll also be escorted from the aircraft upon landing," she continued. "Further travel on our airline is under review and may be permanently restricted." His voice rose with panic. "This is insane." "I didn't know that," she said, interrupting him, "is exactly the problem." With that, she turned and left him there, alone, exposed beneath the weight of his own actions. The ripple effect of her words spread quickly. Passengers straightened in their seats. Some glanced toward Thomas with new respect, others with guilt. One man, earlier silent, leaned slightly into the aisle and said quietly, "Mr. Greer, I'm sorry. I should have said something." Thomas gave a slight nod, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. Another woman spoke up from row 3. "Thank you, sir, for reminding us who we really are when no one's watching." And still, Thomas didn't smile. He didn't need to. The moment had already reshaped the cabin. Justice didn't need to shout. It just needed to stand still long enough to be seen. 15 minutes later, as the plane began its descent, a small but significant gesture unfolded. A junior crew member walked down the aisle with a folded jacket, Thomas's. She placed it gently over his shoulders and said softly, "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Greer. I hope this flight ends better than it began." He tilted his head toward her voice. "So do I," he replied. As the wheels touched down, the cabin erupted in soft applause, directed not at the landing, but at the landing of truth. Bradley didn't clap. He sat stiff, staring out the window, knowing exactly what waited for him beyond the gate. For the first time in a long time, he was no longer untouchable. And Thomas? He remained silent. Every glance from nearby passengers was a verdict. He was no longer just uncomfortable. He was undone. Meanwhile, Thomas Greer remained still, unmoved, his shoulders squared beneath the folded jacket that now rested like a ceremonial sash of quiet power. He didn't turn toward Bradley. He didn't react to the muttered swears under the man's breath or the agitated shifting in his seat. Thomas had nothing left to prove. The plane reached its gate with a soft jolt, and the fastened seatbelt sign flicked off. Then came the voice from the overhead speaker, crisp and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to ask all passengers to remain seated. Law enforcement personnel will board momentarily to assist with a passenger removal." A wave of tension swept through the cabin like wind rushing through tall grass. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes moved to Bradley. He tried to sit still, tried to pretend he wasn't the target, but his chest rose faster, his nostrils flared, and his grip on the armrest tightened. One by one, heads turned toward Thomas. And still he did not speak. He didn't need to. The sound of booted steps echoed faintly outside the aircraft, followed by the muffled hiss of the cabin door opening. Then came the unmistakable voice of authority, calm, clipped, official. "Mr. Carter." Bradley flinched. Listen, this isn't necessary," he said quickly, his words tripping over each other. "This is all a misunderstanding." One of the officers stepped into the cabin, his presence quiet but absolute. "Sir, please stand. You've been flagged for removal due to a violation of federal aviation conduct." "You don't understand," Bradley said, louder now, panic creeping into his tone. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't mean anything. I thought he was." He stopped himself, realizing mid-sentence that the excuse was worse than the act. "You thought he was what?" One of the passengers murmured with disgust. "Nothing," someone else said. The officers remained expressionless, unmoved by his pleas. "This is harassment," Bradley barked. "You're humiliating me in front of everyone." A voice came calmly from the back. "Now you know how it feels." The entire cabin went quiet. The officer gestured toward the aisle. "Please comply, sir." Bradley stood slowly, his face flushed with a mix of rage and humiliation. He didn't look at Thomas. He didn't look at anyone. He kept his head down as he grabbed his bag and shuffled toward the front of the aircraft. But just before he stepped past Thomas's row, his voice cracked out, bitter and small. "All of this, just because I made a few jokes." For the first time since the plane landed, Thomas turned his head slightly, not fully, but enough. His voice was calm, almost soft. "No, all of this. Because you forgot other people are human too." Bradley hesitated, then walked on, disappearing down the jet bridge, swallowed whole by the consequence he never thought would come. The door closed behind him. A breath of release rippled through the cabin. A collective exhale. The passengers didn't cheer. They didn't clap. But the silence left behind was different now. Not the heavy, complicit silence from before. This one carried a kind of quiet justice. Thomas sat back, resting his cane against the seat beside him, his fingers steady, his breath even. The junior flight attendant who had avoided eye contact earlier now stood by his side. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Greer, I want to say I'm sorry, not just for him, for all of us." Thomas didn't respond right away. He turned toward her voice, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said at last. "But apologies are only useful when they lead to change." She nodded slowly, biting her lip. "Understood." As the cabin emptied, row by row, people moved more slowly now, more mindfully. Some paused as they passed Thomas, offering nods, soft words, quiet acknowledgments. No one rushed to disembark. It was as if everyone finally understood that something real had happened here. Something bigger than the flight, bigger than a seat, bigger than one man's cruelty. Thomas didn't rise until the cabin was almost empty. The terminal was bright and sterile as passengers filtered into the arrival hall, dragging their carry-ons, and wearing the dazed expressions of people freshly returned to Earth after hours in the sky. But for Thomas Greer, there was no disorientation. He moved with quiet certainty, the tap of his cane rhythmic against the polished tile as he walked through the concourse. Head held high, posture straight, not as a man who had just landed, but as one who had arrived. Behind him, murmurs still followed, not in the same hushed tones of judgment from earlier, but in a quieter awe, the kind that carries the weight of realization. Those who had watched in silence on the plane now watched him differently, aware of what they had been part of, or what they had failed to stop. No one dared approach him directly. Not yet. But the shift was palpable. Even airport staff moved aside when he passed, not because they recognized his face, but because they sensed something in his presence that demanded space. Waiting near the private terminal wing was a uniformed representative of the airline's executive services. She held a sleek black folder in her hands and greeted Thomas with a soft, "Welcome home, Mr. Greer." He nodded once. "Thank you." She walked in step beside him, guiding him through the VIP channel toward the private office suite reserved for board members. "The report from the cabin crew is already in your file," she said. "HR has been notified. Legal is reviewing the footage." Thomas didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. "And Mr. Carter," he asked evenly, "has been permanently blacklisted," she answered, "from all branches. He's also been referred to corporate security for civil action. We'll be issuing a public response as well, pending your approval." Thomas paused just inside the doors of the executive lounge. "No need for a statement," he said. "Let the story speak for itself." She nodded, understanding. Thomas stepped into the private lounge as the doors closed quietly behind him. The space was silent, luxurious, but none of it mattered to him in that moment. What mattered was that he had walked off that plane hole. He had not raised his voice, not demanded justice through volume. He had let the truth reveal itself in silence, and the weight of that truth had crushed arrogance where it stood. Meanwhile, in a separate corridor on the other side of the airport, Bradley Carter sat alone in a holding room, shoulders slumped, phone confiscated. His voice hoarse from failed attempts to explain himself. His designer blazer was wrinkled, his once pristine shoes scuffed from the hurried exit down the jet bridge. The walls around him were plain, cold, unforgiving. There was no crowd here to entertain, no audience to mock. Just his own reflection in the dark glass of the security office. And in that reflection, for the first time, he saw not a victim of misunderstanding, but the villain of a story everyone else had already heard. Back in the lounge, Thomas took a seat near the wide glass window. He couldn't see the city lights blinking across the skyline, but he felt their warmth through the glass. He didn't need eyes to recognize the beauty of justice. A young attendant brought him tea. He hadn't asked for it, but she placed it carefully on the table beside him, then bowed her head and left without a word. Small gestures. They didn't undo what had happened, but they mattered. They always mattered. As the room settled, Thomas reached into his inside coat pocket and retrieved a folded letter. The paper was creased but clean, the ink bold and clear. It was a draft resignation he had prepared weeks ago. Born from fatigue, from a sense that maybe it was time to step away, to stop fighting. But now, reading it again in the quiet of victory, he tore it neatly in half. He would stay, not for the title, not for pride, but because presence mattered, because people like Bradley still boarded planes every day thinking the sky belonged to them. And someone had to remind the world that the air, like dignity, belongs to everyone. At that moment, the intercom chimed across the terminal. A boarding call echoed in the distance. Another flight, another journey, another chance for someone to be tested or to rise. Thomas remained still, sipping his tea, his fingers relaxed around the porcelain cup. No applause played. No dramatic music swelled. Just the simple, powerful sound of justice having quietly landed. And this time, it wasn't leaving. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives that shine a light on dignity, justice, and the strength it takes to stay silent when the world pushes you to break. What moment in this story struck you the most? Was it the final reveal, the breaking point, or that one quiet sentence that changed everything? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your voice.